Ça va aller? Tu t'es pas fait mal?
Oui, non, non, ça va. J'ai juste déséquilibré. I have some. Yes.
He's the one who is going to talk first. Professor Knittel.
Okay.
Is Professor Knittel already here?
Okay. I would like to send you the question from the Zoom, from the audience of the Zoom. Can I have it on this group? Question from the audience?
Yes. We want to Mr. Knittel first.
Yeah.
You want me to put in a number?
Je vais aller vérifier, je suis pas sûre de moi.
Hello, hello, hello. So we're going to start the first paper of this session, which is more on the macro aspects of critical materials, is by Professor Knittel from MIT. And he's got a cohort paper with Adrien, Concordel and Phuong. And it's about the compendium economic impact of critical mineral and oil prices, basically using a neoclassical growth perspective. Chris, are you online? Can we get the speaker on, please?
I am. Can you hear me?
We can hear you, and now we'd like to see you. Can we make sure that we can see Professor Knittel? It will work eventually. It has worked.
Okay.
So what? Well, happy Thanksgiving to you.
Yes, it is.
I see you've got a few equations on the board.
Thanksgiving morning here in the United States.
Yeah, so happy Thanksgiving. Be nice to the turkeys, I say. Off you go. Thank you. Thank you for coming and joining us online.
Well, yeah, thank you for having me. As was mentioned, this is let's see if this is working. This is co-authored with Adrien Concordel, who's the former graduate student at MIT, and Phuong Ho, who's a postdoc at the center I run at MIT called the Center for Energy and Environmental Policy Research. This, just to mention a little bit of background, this project came out of a larger scale project called the Roosevelt Project, which was started by Ernie Moniz after he stepped down as Secretary of Energy. And the goal of the Roosevelt Project is to understand and chart a path forward for a decarbonized U.S. economy. It started with a set of more academic papers that we called Phase 1. Phase 2 was deep dives into 4 regions of the United States to work with local policymakers and to think about paths forward for them under a decarbonized world. And those areas we chose them because they are traditionally very focused on fossil fuels. The third phase of the project, which is where this came out of, was deep dives into 3 industries. We did the electrical grid, we did steel, and then the third one was thinking about what a decarbonized or certainly built up mining industry might look like in the U.S. In order to understand what the policy requirements are or should be of such a movement, we wanted to understand what the macroeconomic impacts of critical mineral price shocks are, and in particular how they relate to the macroeconomic impacts of oil price shocks. I apologize if these 2 graphs have been put up numerous times over the day and a half of the conference, but my main motivation for diving pretty deep recently into critical mineral markets are these 2 graphs. On the left, we have the mineral requirements of traditional technologies relative to what are likely decarbonized technologies. So on the top panel on the left, you have the mineral requirements of an electric vehicle relative to the mineral requirements of a conventional ICE vehicle. And then below are how we generate electricity, and you can see that the fossil fuel-based ways to generate electricity are much less mineral dependent than decarbonized sources. On the right, which is even more motivation, is the left panel of the right graph is the market share of the top 3 countries producing different things that we take out of the ground. So on the top, you see fossil fuels, oil and natural gas. And then on the bottom, you see several critical minerals. And what you see there is that the production or extraction phase of critical minerals are much more concentrated than fossil fuel, the extraction concentration of fossil fuels. And on the right panel is the graph that keeps me up at night. That is the on the processing side, the top 3 market share. And there you see China dominates just about every mineral on the processing side. And there's good reason that we might be able to get into under Q&A for that. You know, processing is very environmentally detrimental. So it's not clear that a country would even want to do the processing side. But at the same time, China is now, as we've seen over the last few months, using this as a strategic geopolitical tool to extract potential rents from other countries. So that motivated this study, which is trying to understand, again, the macroeconomic impacts of minerals versus fossil fuels. And to do that, we're going to take an off-the-shelf neoclassical economic model that's been used in the literature, that has been parameterized in the literature, to look at the impacts of oil price shocks on the economy. And we're, you know, not to be too self-deprecating, but we're going to effectively take that model, tweak it a little bit, or reinterpret it a little bit to allow us to compare what happens if we have mineral price shocks versus oil price shocks. As a policy nerd, my motivation here, another motivation here, is that in the United States, there's been a lot of discussion about whether or not we should have critical mineral strategic reserves. So in the US, we have a strategic petroleum reserve, which is a government-owned inventory of oil that is effectively about 6 months worth of US oil production. And that is there in case we get in a time of war where we're cut off from the world oil markets, so that we have at least 6 months of production. There has been many discussions in Washington, D.C. as to whether or not we should have a cobalt reserve, a lithium reserve, even a copper reserve. And that's going to be partly determined, at least, by what the macroeconomic impacts are. We're not going to touch the national security reasons for that, which might dominate the macroeconomic reasons. But at least our analysis will give us some idea of whether or not the macroeconomy is as vulnerable to mineral price shocks as they are to oil price shocks. And there's reason to believe that they're not. So if you think about what is the nature of an oil price shock relative to critical minerals, is the way I like to describe it is we're all driving, or most of us are driving around vehicles that we put oil in. So we have a big chunk of capital that in order to use that capital, we need oil. When the price of oil goes up, that capital is fixed. We're stuck with that capital unless we go out and buy an electric vehicle. So in some ways, you can think of an oil price shock as operating on a relatively short-run elasticity of our demand. Now, if we compare that to a critical mineral price shock, if I own an electric vehicle and China raises the price of cobalt, that doesn't affect me in the short run. I have my capital. I just need electricity. China's not impacting the price of electricity by raising the price of cobalt. So China, at least when thinking about whether or not to raise the price of cobalt, is operating off of a long-run elasticity. And of course, we know in economics that long-run elasticities tend to be more elastic than short-run elasticities. So that intuition would suggest that the impact of a critical mineral price shock is going to be smaller than the impact of an oil price shock. But that little story there motivates how we model this. What we're going to do is think about critical minerals as being part of capital and oil as being part of the use costs of that capital. So we're taking the Schubert and Tarnowski model and making that realization and effectively saying when the price of critical minerals double, we're raising the price of capital, obviously weighted by the share of critical minerals as a component of capital. That's the basic idea. So the next few slides are a bunch of math, which I don't think I need to get into, but it's you know, a fairly standard but simple neoclassical model with a representative agent, a fairly simple three-component production function where we have capital, labor, and fuel use. Z is going to be fuel use. That leads to some dynamics in terms of the response to certain oil price or critical mineral price shocks. And how we're going to represent the critical mineral price shock is impacting, like I said, the price of capital. This can be parameterized as either a developed country or a developing country. How those differ is in the cost of the borrowing rate. So the developing country borrowing rate has a higher friction to it. I'm going to show you results for a developed country, but the general patterns are the same. Without any simulations, you can find conditions for which the oil price shock will have a larger impact on as a critical mineral price shock. That we derive the elasticities, the steady state output elasticity with respect to both oil price shocks and mineral price shocks. And in general, that suggests that mineral price shocks are going to be less contractionary or recessionary than oil price shocks. Here's our calibrated parameters. Unless you've dove deep into such a model, they don't mean too much to you a priori, but I'm going to show you graphs in a second. One interesting thing is that, at least in the US, the share of GDP going to oil is now, at least, roughly the same as the share of GDP going to critical minerals. So the results I'm going to show you are not driven by the fact that we just spend more money on oil, and that's why their oil price shocks have a bigger impact on the US economy. We're actually spending just about the same amount on both. And there's a lot of robustness, sensitivity checks in the paper that I'm happy to talk about. So here's the two critical graphs. So again, the thought experiment here is in the orange, we're doubling the price on critical minerals. In the yellow, we're doubling the price on oil. Now, this is, I think, very conservative, because our thought experiment here is we're doubling all critical mineral prices, not just cobalt or lithium or copper or nickel. And there's obviously good reason to believe that that would not happen, even though they're correlated, that wouldn't happen all at once. So if anything, the actual impacts on the economy are going to be even less than what the orange dotted line looks like. But on the left, we have welfare. On the right, we have output. And the scale, you know, is pretty dense, in the sense that we're talking about at most a 2% drop in welfare and a 2.5% drop in output. But you see that the impacts on critical mineral price shocks are about half those of oil price shocks. If we look at what's happening deeper into the economy, as you would imagine from increasing capital stock prices, there is a bigger impact on capital stock from doubling of critical minerals. They're about the same impact on debt in the long run, but initially there's a bigger impact on debt from doubling critical mineral prices. If we look at employment, you see much smaller impacts on employment, and actually you see an increase in employment from both, and this is just coming from the Cobb-Douglas nature of the production function. You're going to substitute into other inputs when an input price increases, and as you would expect, we see a smaller impact on consumption. So the key parameters here are inside the production function. What are the elasticities of substitution across different inputs? Obviously, what is the friction or what is the access to external finance, as well as what's the budget debt of each of the inputs. I've already talked about this. So what are the policy implications of this? I would say if we're going to think about strategic reserves from a macroeconomic reason or motivation, this is more comforting that and it's more comforting more generally because at least in the US, historically, oil price shocks have led to recessions, and maybe in a world where we're decarbonized, that's going to be much less the case, which it has its own policy implications. Again, we might want strategic reserves for national security reasons, but the macroeconomic motivations of them are not as large as they are for oil. So why don't I stop there? And I appreciate the time. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chris. I hope you have time for some question and answers. So, one Aude, behind you, the lady.
Thank you very much for this very, very clear and interesting presentation. I had a question regarding recycling, because then when you have China increasing the price of cobalt, for instance, then it's not only that if I already have a car, I'm not affected. Actually, if I already have a car, the value of my battery is increasing. So, do you plan to take this into account, or what do you expect? How do you expect that would change the results?
Chris, we're collecting questions, so there's one or two more questions. There's a question here from Eugene James online. What's the likelihood that we see the establishment of an organization similar to OPEC to control critical mineral prices? So that's one question. Then there's also a little question from myself. I remember that if this is the same Tarnowski paper, they make a big song and dance that the oil price increases can affect the ability of a country to borrow. So the financial markets, access to financial markets, that's a bit hidden in your model, but it's nevertheless, it's there. Could you say something about it as well? So here you have 3 questions. There's one fourth question from Chris Adam.
Thank you. It's a really nice paper. This is a very small question. Given that you're looking at, you motivated the paper by contrasting the short-run elasticity on an oil price shock with a medium to longer-term elasticity with critical minerals. Your welfare calculation is going to be quite highly dependent on discount rates, I presume, in that setup. Can you, maybe I missed it in the presentation, but can you say something about the comparative welfare effects and their sensitivity to assumptions about discounting? Thank you.
Thank you. Chris, the floor is yours.
Those are all very great questions. Thank you. So on the recycling side, you're right. Within this model, there is an ability to recycle, and that may be an important. We could make 2 adjustments to this model, and this would be a much larger project, but something that we've thought about. One is that we would allow for substitution across minerals within the production function. And you're seeing this already in markets. So half of Tesla's cars, for example, use a technology that doesn't use cobalt in the batteries. And that is in direct response to cobalt prices. So it would be nice to unpack that that production function and allow for substitution across minerals. And then that could allow us to see what happens if we just shock one mineral price as opposed to all of them. The second tweak that I would like to do is recycling. So to include a recycling production function, if you will, inside of the model that would allow us to look at what are the changes in the incentives to recycle. We haven't done that. So again, I would say that makes our results even more conservative. On the OPEC for minerals, I would say we already have that because of the left panel or the right panel on the right graph here, that China's market share of the processing of these critical minerals is as large, if not larger, than OPEC's market share of oil already. Now, we are doing some work to see if Chinese processing companies coordinate. It's not clear that they have to, but given the structure of the government, you could imagine that they are coordinating. So I think that's what's scaring a lot of us, is that we already have OPEC in critical minerals, and many of the critical minerals. On the access to financial markets, you're exactly right, that the oil price shocks impact debt, which then reduces access to world financial markets. That is more important for when we calibrate the non-OECD countries, but wasn't as important as we expected it to be. I believe that is part of the sensitivity analysis in the paper.
Okay.
The last question about discount rates, I don't think that's part of our sensitivity analysis, and you're exactly right that we should have thought about that does play a critical role here. So that's something that we're going to add. So thank you very much for that comment.
Thank you, Chris. This was a very neat presentation, a very neat paper, and thank you for coming all the way in on Zoom. I know it's always difficult. It's much appreciated, and we'll be back on you with further comments. So thank you very much.
Great. Thank you very much.
Our next speaker is Ciftci. He is a colleague from Oxford, and he's going to talk on financing the responsible supply of energy transition materials for sustainable development. Off you go. Yeah, you can take this.
Testing. Do we have the slide changing? Or? Oh, okay. Hello, everyone. My name is Mete, and I'm a postdoctoral researcher based at the School of Geography and Environment of the University of Oxford. I'm working on the RESET project, the Rethinking Natural Resources project, with Rick and John, who presented yesterday some insights from our project. Happy to talk about it if you'd like to. Yeah, thank you very much, Rick and Rabah, Bulbul, for the organization and all the people who took part in this organization. It's been a great pleasure to be here. So, starting from the typical housekeeping stuff, I think everyone probably has touched upon this topic, so I'm just not going to polish the same stone. We need more and more critical minerals, and as you can see, for some of these minerals like lithium, the demand by 2040 can be up to 9 times of what it was in 2023. And 91%, up to 91% of this demand could be driven by the clean energy technologies. So I'm sorry to mention that this report, this presentation is part of a paper that I prepared based on our report from the UNEP International Resource Panel report on the financing of sustainable supply of critical minerals. I don't know if any of you have heard of this, the release of this report last month. Well, now you have. Yes. So it's a 400 pages long report about finance of critical mineral supply with all these different aspects that I'm hoping to cover, and it's an interesting read. So we're hoping to turn it, hopefully, into an academic paper, but we have some way to go on that. And but yeah, so the demand for critical minerals has been rising sharply, but at the same time, it's not equitably distributed, whereas the demand from developed nations and China has been so high compared to developing countries. This supply is usually coming from, mostly coming from the global south. And clean energy systems could multiply demand for transition minerals by 2040, but the issues may not come from, the main issues may not come from the geological scarcity, but because of investment bottlenecks, long permitting timelines, and rising ESG costs. And mining remains vital to economic development, but it faces escalating social and environmental pressures that shape its long-term viability and legitimacy. And yeah, we've been talking a lot about the social and environmental impacts of mining today, but it must be emphasized that it has also economic benefits, to many communities, but it's hard to transform this. But and in that sense, investments can be very helpful, but we need up to $450 billion US dollars of new investment into mining by 2030 to see to maybe achieve the transition objectives that we have. So in our report, three regions emerge as hotspots of critical minerals. South America, and as you can imagine, Africa and China as the dominant producer of in so many minerals, as I'm going to share in the next slide. An interesting aspect is technological complexity has surged, and modern industries now rely nearly all metallic elements, and we've never been in the history of humanity used all of such a variety of elements from the periodic table all at once. And yeah, and if we talk about China, as I said, it's commanding both extraction and processing across most critical mineral supply chains. And today, it's impossible to imagine that a metal hasn't passed through China in its life cycle. Africa can supply a major share of key transition minerals, but faces governance challenges that risk turning mineral wealth into renewed resource dependency. South America combines vast reserves of lithium, copper, and niobium with high export reliance and expanding foreign investment driven by global decarbonization. So I wanted to share this slide. It's another way of maybe presenting data that we've been talking about today. As you can see, the minimum that China produces in terms of mines and metals would be 20%, and in this table for tantalum and strontium, but it can go up to more than 97% for gallium and more than 95% for germanium. And this is just one figure that shows the strong establishment of China's dominance in the global production of metals and minerals, and also cement. And for South America, you can see that the producers host reserves of niobium up to 92% of the global reserves, and for lithium, molybdenum, and copper, reserves and production varying between 30% to nearly 50%. And I think Amanda kind of covered this today. So some of the key challenges in attracting investment into sustainable investment into mining are high capital costs, price volatility, and long lead times. And as you can see, long lags between discovery and production generate persistent mismatches between expected and realized prices. And futures markets amplify short-term volatility, but might help stabilize long-term expectations. So here is another way of showing how, in some cases, opening up a new mine can take up to 20 years, but there have been cases of maybe taking 50 years. And it can be as short as maybe less than 4 years for lithium mines in Australia, but still, it's taken a very long time, and this is affecting investor decisions in making long-term decisions for mining industry. And metal prices strongly influence profitability. They react sharply to geopolitical shocks, technological change, and supply disruptions. China exerts coordinated influence in global mining finance, blending state direction with market mechanisms to secure resources and expand processing capacity. Africa relies heavily on foreign investment, but uneven governance, price dependence, and limited local processing restrict broader economic benefits. And in the case of South America, large reserves need to be balanced with diverse fiscal regimes, have been balanced with diverse fiscal regimes, where tax stability, infrastructure, and environmental standards shape investor confidence. So, we can see that ESG standards are more and more becoming more and more important for the capital flows. So, in talking about sustainable mineral supply, we also wanted to include the case of circularity. And as you can see in this picture, actually, when we talk about circularity, the first things that usually comes to mind is recycling. However, recycling is actually in the best case, maybe the third worst option that we might have. And until we reach to recycling, we have way more to do, maybe, starting from reducing the demand, maybe, rethinking how we approach our mineral use, repairing, refurbishing, and all these, like remanufacturing, all these options. But recycling is still essential for a circular economy because if we could imagine the coming wave of waste from solar panels, wind turbines, and batteries, they will reach up to tens of millions of tons, comparable to the level of waste electrics and electronics. And this could create both a disposal challenge and a potential secondary resource base. However, a key challenge is, like one of many, like 10 major challenges that were listed in the report. One of the key ones is there's a mismatch between the end of life of when they will reach end of life and when we can be able to use them, because most renewable energy systems come with a guaranteed lifetime of nearly 20 to 25 years. Like, and this is only like when their productivity goes down to 80%. So it's assumed that so many users might continue to use solar panels, wind turbines, maybe even beyond that period. And this can be extended by remanufacturing and repairing and all these like circular approaches. So it's really important to align recycling objectives with other circularity objectives in that sense and consider this gap. We won't be able to use the electric vehicle batteries immediately in the next 5 years or so. And yeah, so we have also product design challenges. Many products are not designed for end-of-life recycling or maybe even also in considering the circularity aspects. There are so many different technologies that make efficient recovery difficult. There are market uncertainties such as volatile prices, slow feedstock availability, unclear technological pathways. And these make investors hesitant to finance large, long-term recycling infrastructure. There's also issues about informal recycling. They're significant for so many developing countries. You can see, for example, in China, tuk-tuks visiting homes to collect electronic waste. And this sometimes leads to 90% collection rates in developing nations, but that might also mean that might come up with low recycling efficiency rates, whereas the opposite is the case in many developed countries. Financial barriers remain important because primary mining enjoys subsidies and policy support that recyclers lack, and this creates an uneven playing field and limits investment in secondary production. And when the measures are not discriminative, so when they don't favor particularly the secondary producers, it often ends up favoring the primary producers against the secondary ones. So what I mean is, if there's a subsidy that is introduced to the market for the whole economy, it will benefit primary producers more than it would the secondary ones. And this means that we need some targeted measures. So we need blended finance models, for example, sustainability-linked loans and impact investment, which can lower capital costs for recycling ventures, in especially high-risk demonstration projects that could be like novel approaches such as bioleaching techniques. And we need fiscal measures, including reduced tariffs on recycling equipment, preferential access to public procurement, and tax credits. We need, and finally, we want to make a call. I think Rod mentioned this yesterday, remining of mine tailings as a new approach. Like, there are so many mine tailings around the world that are just waiting like a ticking time bomb. That is hazardous to their environment. And we're proposing that maybe we can have a database. Well, we already have a database on mine tailings, but these databases don't show their remining potential, which could be an interesting way to recover minerals from these mine tailings, because most of them have been established years ago, like decades ago, and they contain a lot of valuable metals which have been considered waste at their time. And yes, this brings us to the next slides. So the mineral supply depends on navigating a trilemma of security, economic viability, and environmental sustainability within a capital-intensive multi-decade project cycle. Exploration absorbs billions with extremely low success rates. So according to an estimate, only 1 in 10,000 mineral showings turn into a producing mine. And while development demands vast upfront investment supported by complex equity and debt structure. So some projects can require a capex up to 20 billion. This is all in this, like navigating the geological uncertainty, volatile prices, regulatory shifts, and long-term closure liabilities that require dedicated funds. So this is another thing that sometimes affects mining decisions, because now mining companies are required to propose plans for what happens after the closure of the mine. And this can take up to decades. And high capex, sustained reinvestment needs, so these are all shaping the decisions. And governments can enable investment through geological data, infrastructure and regulation, while market structure favors large firms over chronically underfunded junior firms, junior explorers mainly. And responsible finance, ESG screening, and tailored mechanisms for smaller producers can increasingly be central in aligning mining investments with sustainability goals. Yes. Sustainable finance is reshaping mining by embedding ESG standards into investment decisions. And we're talking about an industry, like a project, global project pipeline of $1.2 trillion right now. So this is showing that how large it is, that the pool. And frameworks like SDGs, Sustainable Development Goals, Paris Agreement, and many other emerging taxonomies that we're mentioning in the paper, they can guide banks and investors in supporting responsible mining. So we already have a lot of frameworks in that sense. And green and sustainability-linked loans, bonds, and blended finance options are expanding rapidly as an observation, and long-term capital is essential. So we ran a survey for this report, and according to this survey, sustainability raises short-term costs, but so ESG, taking ESG measures raises short-term costs, but it lowers long-term risk. And according to the 50 or so respondents, while social factors such as social license to operate were deemed most critical by the companies for their businesses, environmental priorities such as water resource management, biodiversity production, offsetting, and were identified as major cost drivers. While social, not paying attention to social risks might lead your business to be shut, and trying to offset for environmental costs is the main cost driver, basically. And yes, the next slide is about the ASM. It's a major, artisanal scale mining is a major global employer. So we need to bear this in mind when talking about it, because it's supporting millions of people directly and many more so indirectly. And it contributes sizable shares of cobalt, gold, diamond, and development minerals, as some might call them. Yet most activity remains informal and poorly remunerated, and this leaves miners with little bargaining power against creditors. They're sometimes illegal lenders, or their access to markets. So environmental harm, hazardous working conditions, and weak safety provisions are common, because operations rely on rudimentary tools and regulatory oversight. And this is despite the fact that we have voluntary standards such as Craft and Fairmind, which promote cleaner methods. And ASM's contribution is becoming even more strategic with the demand rise, but persistent gender inequalities, this is another aspect to consider actually, continue to expose women to unsafe work and limit their economic participation. So formalization is essential to improve livelihoods and sustainability, but it demands far more than legal status. It requires secure land rights, predictable licensing, transparent taxation, reliable market channels, environmental safeguards, and social protection systems. That's great, that's enough. Access to finance also remains the central bottleneck, because most miners are trapped in informal and often exploitative credit arrangements that prevent investment in safer equipment, environmental management, or productivity improvements. We're talking about a serious vicious cycle here. And the Meridian principles, I don't know if you've ever heard of that, Meridian principles. It's like a revamp of equator principles introduced by Daniel Franks and Paul Rogers, offer a structured approach to responsible ASM finance by linking credit access to compliance with recognized environmental, social, and governance standards. And to conclude, I want to maybe emphasize a couple of key recommendations that we were making in the report. So sustainable finance will require fiscal and regulatory reforms that penalize harmful practices, reduce subsidies for unsustainable extraction, and channel public and blended finance towards climate-aligned ventures. And we made proposals such as raw material border adjustment, which could help ensure that companies internalizing social and environmental costs are not priced out by lower standard producers, which would create incentives for higher global ESG benchmarks. And finally, we want to propose institutions, stronger institutions, global oversight bodies, and potentially a UN convention on sustainable resources that would create rules and increase transparency. Here, I made this is just for the fun purposes only. International Minerals and Metals Agency was proposed also in the report, which could oversee all of this proposed measures. So,
thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you for a very extremely comprehensive overview of a very large report. It saves us reading it, so thank you very, very much. Are there any questions? I've got one question online, but maybe some questions in the room. Yes, Grégoire.
Should we switch?
Thank you for the presentation. When you are speaking about border adjustment, it's another way to speak about tariffs.
Is it working? Yes. So that's indeed one of the measures that that were introduced in like as a raw material border adjustment, which we hoped that would level the playing field by reflecting sustainability standards and traded prices, so that ethically produced materials wouldn't be undercut by the producers who have a worse track record.
Good. There is a question from Gaston Beauvau-Cuy. As the demand will increase for critical minerals in the coming years, some alternatives to critical minerals will probably become on stream, like synthetic solutions. They're using low intensity of critical minerals. And the question of this gentleman is, do you think that would lead to a loss in value of critical mineral reserves for countries?
I think it might, and this might also be the case with substitution. So we're seeing now more and more the use of sodium-based batteries instead of lithium-based ones, which have a different purpose than lithium-powered batteries, but still, it already started raising questions about whether lithium will continue to be the main battery mineral and keep its position. So this is exactly one of the uncertainties that we're facing. But I think energy transition is still one of the main drivers of the demand alongside today now AI and defense. But amongst them, I would say defense is probably the shortest term one, whereas AI and energy transition will likely stay at least 10 to 15 years as a major driver.
Thank you. Are there any more questions from the room? Otherwise, I think one question from Roderick.
Oh. We're out of mics again. I think those online can only hear. Yes.
You spoke about standards and certifications, especially as they relate to ASM, artisanal and small scale mining. Does the report, or do you have views on standards and certifications for more industrial scale mining? There's been a plethora of both industry developed and non-industry developed, almost competing standards that has made that space quite confusing. There's been talk about consolidation of standards. And can you say a little more about that? Does the report say anything more about that?
Yes, it does. Thank you for the question. And I know it can be mind-boggling sometimes to deal with all these compliance standards. I think it's possible to categorize them. Some of them are more designed for governments, like EITI maybe, but some of them are more industry-focused, like IRMA, Initiative for Responsible Mining Alliance. If someone can correct my, whether this was the right acronym. IRMA is one of the focal cases, I think, covered in the report. And it's a growingly, it has a growing coverage now, especially in South America. Many producers and other stakeholders are also involved, including indigenous communities. But I think, this latter require more attention and maybe more place in the world of energy transition minerals, because a recent study shows that 25% of the mining-related disputes in the world are now including indigenous actors. More and more we are expanding our mining boundary into more and more indigenous territories, and I think their voice needs to be more heard in the making of mining decisions. And in that regard, Cachiupe protocol developed in Argentina could be a good starting point. It was developed for lithium mining.
At this note, we will move on to the next speaker.
Yes.
The next speaker is Jim Cust. He has many years, despite being much younger than me, experience in natural resources, the Resource Charter, the World Bank, and many other things. So you'll bring some of your experience into this talk as well, the macro perspectives on critical materials. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Rick. And thank you to the organizers, to Bulbul for all the hard work, and to Rick and Rabah and Chris for the invitation. This is my first time visiting FERDI, so I'm very happy for that. Now, the challenge I was given was I was asked to write something that was punchy and policy relevant, I think is what Rabah said to me. So I'm going to try and deliver on that. So I sit in the Chief Economist's Office for Africa at the World Bank. We cover all of sub-Saharan Africa in our team. And while we have a research function, we also engage a lot with policymakers in the region. And so this work is very much inspired by a lot of the conversations I've been having recently with policymakers in countries that are current and potential producers of critical minerals. And just to give you a bit of motivation, this is my motivation at least for this work, is that this is a list of countries, and not necessarily an exhaustive list, but a list of countries that are currently about to create sovereign wealth funds, either in the planning stages or that this is very close to being completed. And you'll see many of these countries have many of the minerals that we've been talking about. Not exclusively critical minerals, and in the Somalian case, this may be oil and gas related, but these are countries that are creating sovereign wealth funds that have some resource base, and there is some link between their resource base and the revenues their resource base may potentially generate to finance, to fund this sovereign wealth fund. So as you see, this is quite a long list. A lot of these countries are in sub-Saharan Africa. So in my day job, I go to a lot of meetings with policymakers discussing these proposals. And what's interesting to me is that on the face of it, some of these countries, to take Malawi as an example, doesn't currently have an operating mine. They have a lot of potential, and there's a lot of negotiations ongoing and some projects in development, but they're not yet there in terms of having the sort of classic revenue management challenges that a lot of the literature that exists is speaking to in terms of why you might want to create a sovereign wealth fund, right? We think about these kinds of different motivations for sovereign wealth funds. The Norwegians have this pension fund, which is all about intergenerational equity held in foreign assets. You can think about stabilization funds like the Chilean stabilization fund, that is, you save on sunny days and then you can deplete on rainy days. And this has this relationship to the budget. And then you've got this third proposal that maybe there's a parking function, and many people in the room have worked on this literature. There's a parking function that you might temporarily park some of your revenues offshore while you invest in investing and you build the capacity to absorb these resource revenues domestically. What's interesting about these conversations is that those three main objectives are not necessarily front and center in a policymaker's mind. And you may see why as we go through this. So the first thing to note is that many of these countries are actually heavily indebted at the moment. So this is the debt sustainability analysis, the most recent debt sustainability analysis for each of these countries, and you'll see several of them are in serious risk of debt distress, if not debt distress issues. So we're not talking about an environment where there's a savings glut and a fiscal instrument needs to be created to manage the savings glut. Okay, so that's sort of the motivation. Now the bigger picture, if we zoom way out, of course, the big challenge here is that in sub-Saharan Africa at least, being resource rich, whether it's minerals or petroleum, has not delivered the kind of growth and resilient growth that we hoped it would. So there's been sustained low growth in resource-producing economies really since 2015. This is the most recent IMF data, and it shows that still to this day, the resource-intensive economies underperform the regional average, even 10 years since the sort of end of the last commodity price boom. So this is characterized by both weak non-resource sector GDP growth, but also this weak resilience to price shocks. And so you can see why there might be a lot of interest in sovereign wealth funds from a stabilization point of view, from a resilience to shocks point of view. The success that the Chileans have had could be very instructive here in terms of there were sunny days, and there will be sunny days again, and you save in the sunny days, and this was obviously a very successful strategy for Chile when copper prices fell. The other thing that characterizes the current era is the heavy indebtedness. So this is just an illustration of the debt service burdens by different regions of the world, and as you see, Sub-Saharan Africa carries some of the highest interest payment burdens, which is now a big challenge in many countries in the region, including many of these resource-rich countries, including many of these countries that are considering the creation of sovereign wealth funds. Okay, so one of the examples from the past, many of you will be familiar with this, but I'll recap it for those of you who aren't. Ghana discovered oil in 2007, the Jubilee oil field, and in 2011 they created a heritage fund, a sovereign wealth fund, alongside a whole raft of revenue management legislation to manage these oil revenues. Now, one of the interesting things about the Heritage Fund was it basically committed the country to depositing a fixed share of oil revenues each year into the Heritage Fund. It didn't do what the Chileans did, which is to say we save on sunny days and we dissave back into the budget on rainy days. It said, no, while there's oil revenues being generated, we're going to put money into the fund. Now, for those of you who know the story, you know the sort of the sad direction it went in, which is that the fund got set up, money started going into the fund, everything was great, but at the same time the government was borrowing very heavily in Eurobond markets. So commercial rate sovereign debt. And in fact, there was a 5% differential at the time between the rate at which they were borrowing this Eurobond debt and the returns that the fund was generating. Not to mention the fact the amount they borrowed ended up being $7 billion compared to the 400 million that they saved into the fund. And if that wasn't bad enough, because of the way this deposit rule had been specified in legislation, they couldn't even deplete the heritage funds to pay off the debt. Now, there was big debate and debate still ongoing in Ghana about whether they should now deplete the fund to pay off the debt, but it wasn't structured in that way originally. So, and just the illustration here, this is the collapse in capital expenditure that happened in the years following the oil discovery. You see the year the Sovereign Wealth Fund was created, the green line is debt in the country, gross debt went sharply upwards. The fiscal balance, which is the red line, stayed negative and close to zero, and savings didn't increase significantly. So we didn't get this sort of domestic investment boom effect that is what people like Paul and others were advocating for as a sort of update of the old fiscal frameworks, was to say countries like Ghana shouldn't do the Norway. They shouldn't put all the money in Wall Street. They should find ways to invest domestically. But one of those ways in the short term might be paying down your debt. And unfortunately, Ghana went in the other direction. Okay, and the sort of the punchline was there was a collapsing growth despite very optimistic growth forecasts by the IMF. And ultimately, or not ultimately, just a few years later, by 2015, there was an IMF program because Ghana got into debt distress, and another one again in 2023. So it's been a very disappointing decade plus. But Ghana's not alone. So now we'll look at countries who have recently created sovereign wealth funds. This is not an exhaustive list again, but just to give you a picture. So we have Ghana, we have Colombia, we have Senegal, Zimbabwe, Mongolia, Guyana, Madagascar, Mozambique, Suriname. So a mix of mineral producers and petroleum producers. And the statistics I'm giving you are at the time of the year when the sovereign wealth fund was created. And so you'll see the first column, the debt as a percentage of GDP. Many of these countries were heavily indebted the year they created the sovereign wealth fund. Also, the fiscal balance was consistently very negative. And then, unfortunately, in the final column, you'll see there have been significant IMF programs, sometimes contemporaneous with the creating of a sovereign wealth fund, but in some cases a few years before or after the fund was created. And so all of this is to say that these sovereign wealth funds were created not obviously at the time when there is this sort of fiscal surplus that you need to manage. There seems to be other things going on. So what else have we observed since 2010? Well, the first thing is we know that there's been significant new natural resource discoveries in Africa, but in the global south more broadly. A big uptick in mineral discoveries, as well as petroleum discoveries in sub-Saharan Africa. We heard from Amanda that hasn't necessarily translated into the same level of investment, development of mines, but certainly there's a lot more being found in these parts of the world. But we also have the very positive image that countries like Chile and Botswana and Norway have, that in the policymakers I talk to, they still consider these as the exemplars and the aspirational peers. And part of the reason why these sovereign wealth funds are so popular is because these are held up as examples of the successful natural resource-rich economies that you should aspire to. And this is one of the most famous things they have. They have funds. Paul talked about the Pula Fund in Botswana. You know, I've already talked about Norway and Chile. But what we have seen is that countries have pursued some of the sort of new fiscal frameworks that were proposed about 15 years ago. So there was an IMF update in 2012 that brought together a lot of the literature that Rick and Paul and Rabah and others have worked on. Basically, we heard from Paul about this emphasis on raising the rate of domestic investment. So one of the goals, if you're a capital scarce economy, is not to replicate Norway and hold a lot of offshore assets, but to actually raise the rate of domestic investment. We've seen increasing emphasis on that in lower income resource-rich countries. That there is some role for funds in stabilization, but what we haven't seen is countries really adopting this in the sort of Chilean model, and even less on the parking fund model. We haven't seen much adoption of that at all. And unfortunately, countries have exercised much more reliance on debt for expanding investment and consumption, and much less on paying down debt. So a lot of this literature emphasized in the early years, there's an opportunity to use resource revenues simply to just pay down your debts. And in fact, we've seen the opposite dynamic. And what we're increasingly seeing, the funds that I've showed you, both the recent ones and the pending ones, have an increasing emphasis on a domestic investment function. In many cases, this is actually separated from the budget process. So in the Ghanaian case, the resource revenues were deposited with no reference to what the budget position was. It was a share of oil revenues that go into it. The fund being proposed in Guinea, for example, is the same, that they're discussing having a share of the Simandou revenues being deposited directly into the fund, and there not being some link between the budgetary position and the fund. So we've seen a lot of severe macro fiscal risks for newly resource-rich countries, and the question for this conference is: do we anticipate the same kinds of challenges materializing in critical mineral countries? So examples in recent years have been Ghana and Mozambique, Senegal, Mongolia, Suriname. Some in petroleum, but not exclusively in petroleum. And of course, we worry about this dynamic known as the pre-resource curse, which we saw in Ghana and other countries, where you can get into this very difficult macro-fiscal situation even before resource revenues really start ramping up, just on the sort of the early years following a resource discovery. And so there was a piece written in 2018 by Mahai and Bauer, reacting to the sort of Ghanaian experience and pointing out that there was a risk that countries were shifting towards these sort of supposedly premature sovereign wealth funds, that there was a trend that they were worried we would start to observe. And so this analysis is basically now we have more data, now we have a bit more history, we can actually test some of their warnings and see what the story looks like. So there are more than 100 countries out there with sovereign wealth funds, but only around half of them are resource-based. And we know some of the most famous ones were very much linked to resource revenues. At the moment, only about 34% are mineral-based, although as you saw from the list of newly planned ones, this balance is shifting more and more towards the critical mineral side. Many of the petroleum-rich countries already have funds, so the newer ones tend to be the mining-funded ones. And we've already heard about some of the prominent, famous mineral-based ones. So out of these 9 that are coming, all but 1 are mineral-funded. And so this analysis I'm going to present, some of is based on a new data set of these resource-financed sovereign wealth funds. So what does the picture look like? You've got a concentration of them in sub-Saharan Africa, but obviously quite a sort of wide global distribution. There was a big ramp up in the 2000s and 2010s. And if you add the planned column on top of the 2020s, you see that this is going to be another bumper decade, probably. It might even exceed the number created in the 2020s. So this is definitely a busy time for sovereign wealth fund creation. Now, what do we observe over time in terms of, this is the net borrowing position of countries at the time of creating a sovereign wealth fund. And you see over time, these countries are more in a negative borrowing position than a positive borrowing position relative to the 2000s and the early 2010s. Similarly, we see this upward trend in terms of the debt to GDP ratio. Over time, these countries are increasingly indebted in the year of sovereign wealth fund creation. And they're increasingly created also in countries that have relatively lower shares of export. We've lost the. Thank you. Relatively lower shares of. On the left-hand side, we see resource exports as a share of total exports, and on the right-hand side, we see the resource revenues as a percentage of GDP. And so again, this could be simply a mechanical effect of the really resource-rich countries created sovereign wealth funds in previous decades, and the slightly less resource-rich countries are creating them today. But we see this sort of consistent pattern over time. So this is another way of representing the debt position of the countries as a percentage of GDP. And the countries colored in red, you'll see were creating their sovereign wealth funds with more than 20% debt to GDP ratios, which is 72% of the sample of resource-funded sovereign wealth funds in the world for which we have the data at the time. And so this sort of runs counter to the literature where people like Paul and Rick were writing about how resource revenues are an opportunity to pay down your debts. And so instead of creating a savings instrument simultaneous to your debt. Similarly, the fiscal balance, overwhelmingly negative, but this has been a trend towards this overwhelmingly negative position over time. It's sort of getting worse as we go year by year. And then fiscal rules. We heard a bit about fiscal rules earlier. Rabah's worked on this a lot. The number of countries that had fiscal rules at the time of sovereign wealth fund creation is actually smaller than the number of countries that didn't have any fiscal rules. And actually, if you talk to policymakers, many of them see the sovereign wealth fund as a mechanism of fiscal discipline, rather than something that you might achieve fiscal discipline first in order to have a sovereign wealth fund. And so there's sort of different ideas out there about what it's going to deliver in terms of fiscal prudence. So we can ask, how did these sort of premature funds perform? And here, basically, I'm using some of the earlier data on countries that were heavily indebted at the time of sovereign wealth fund creation, countries that were heavily in fiscal deficit at the time of sovereign wealth fund creation, or countries that had very low resource revenues or resource exports at the time of sovereign wealth fund creation. And we can sort of, for the moment, tag these as premature and then put them up as a comparison against the other countries that didn't meet those criteria. And what these two charts show is they're basically 45-degree charts. So you have debt on both sides. On the y-axis, you have the debt before the year of sovereign wealth fund creation, the 5 years before. And then on the x-axis, you have the 5 years after sovereign wealth fund creation. And so basically, if you lie on to the right of the 45-degree line in our left chart, then you became more indebted after sovereign wealth fund creation compared to before sovereign wealth fund creation. And we have a similar version, a similar type of question on the right-hand side, but it's now, if you're on the right-hand side, your fiscal balance got worse after sovereign wealth fund creation compared to your fiscal balance being better before sovereign wealth fund creation. And with the debted one, we see a lot of countries becoming more indebted, particularly these sort of supposedly premature sovereign wealth funds. We don't necessarily see as clear a shift, but we see that the premature funds tend to remain similarly in deficit in terms of fiscal balance. So, however you read this, this is not associated with strongly improving fiscal position as a consequence of sovereign wealth fund creation. Now, of course, this is not causal. This is simply some correlations, but you can start to see the picture emerging from the data set. Now, why do we care? Why might we be worried about this? Of course, one motivation is what happened in Ghana, that the sovereign wealth fund was actually part of the story in terms of the exacerbating debt crisis. But we might also worry that this is just not good value for money, right? So if we think about how expensive it is to borrow, in the Ghana case, I told you there was a 5% differential between the Eurobond rate and the return on the sovereign wealth fund. This is when Eurobonds were like 8%. So it was still bad then, but Ghana was borrowing at something like 8% at the time. This is the most recent yields on emerging market, lower income country debt. And of course, borrowing is much more costly today. Now, in the data, we know that for the more well-established sovereign wealth funds, they've yielded pretty modest but consistent financial returns. And so in the extreme case, you have a sovereign wealth fund in New Zealand that actually does do a bit of borrowing to fund its sovereign wealth fund. It's a pension fund. But it borrows at such a low rate that it can outperform its borrowing costs in terms of fund performance. This is not the luxury that we have in countries where there are very high borrowing rates. And it's a very big hill to climb if you're borrowing Eurobonds at 12 to 20% to then beat that with your sovereign wealth fund. Okay, so what are some of the preconditions that we might consider to be suboptimal towards the sort of definition of what we might consider to be a premature? Yes. So many of these countries, we observe, they do not have any savings, at least not yet. Many of these countries do not have significant resource revenues, at least not yet. No fiscal surplus. In many cases, they have no fiscal rule or a track record of fiscal discipline. And there might be other institutional preconditions that we might consider or that we might at least worry about. So the integrity of the budget process. We heard from Paul yesterday about the quality of public investment management. This is very relevant when you're creating sovereign wealth funds to do domestic investment. And what are the reasons that we might worry about this increasing prevalence of so-called premature sovereign wealth funds? So the first point I made is that it's very costly to use your credit cards to put money in the piggy bank, right? And this is increasingly true the more of an emerging market economy you are, the more lower income, because your borrowing costs are that much higher. There may simply be a higher payoff to deploying your capacity and your political capital elsewhere. So you may not need the sovereign wealth fund in year 1, you may need it in year 5 or in year 10, and so there might be other priorities that you can deploy your limited capacity and expertise to. I think what is emerging from this analysis, and others have looked at this too, that the existence of a sovereign wealth fund, particularly one that has no link to a fiscal anchor, does not generate fiscal discipline on its own. And I think there's a common perception that this may be the way of delivering fiscal discipline on its own, and I don't think that's borne out by the data. Final 2 points, if I can, Rick. And so there is a risk of neglecting other macro fiscal stability priorities. There's, of course, a risk of capture with these funds, that they are often subverting the budgetary process and don't have a link back to the budgetary process. And of course, in the worst case scenario, funds can become a contributing factor to the resource curse. So thank you very much. And final thing I just wanted to mention is this work, we are launching a newly commissioned World Bank Group study, which is going to be investigating lots of different aspects of how to leverage critical minerals for jobs and growth in Africa, not just considering the macro perspectives, but many of the perspectives that you're all thinking about. And so I welcome anyone to drop me a line if you're interested in learning more. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. There'll be questions on the floor, but whilst they think, I've got a few, so I will ask first one. And Paul, Tony Venables, myself, and many others have done this kind of these sovereign wealth funds and kind of the savings Norway model was often like, that would be a good thing to do. But of course, they haven't been doing it because they've been borrowing to save, and it's a kind of the worst type of leverage you can possibly think of, isn't it? Because normally you leverage by borrowing cheap and then getting higher risky returns, but that's not what they've been doing. So there must be somewhere behind that a political economy story, which you could have teased out perhaps a bit more. Why are they borrowing so much? Why are they doing this stupid strategy? And you kind of touched upon it, but not really that much. And I think that should be it's the key thing, the borrowing to save, and why that's so stupid, or maybe not. It obviously politically it was attractive for them to do it, and then the investments came down, GDP went down, it was all a complete disaster. Ghana is a good example, but then you showed it was a bit wider. But if you could maybe say a bit more on that political economy, and then keep that there, and whilst I collect some extra questions. Chris Adams.
Thank you, Jim. A great presentation. Really enjoyed that. I just wanted to connect what you're talking about to thinking a little bit further ahead. And what inspired me to think a lot about this is, I don't know if you know Mark Aguiar's Mundell-Fleming lecture from 2024, the IMF annual macro lecture. And he started with this sort of well-known observation that the fastest growing economies in the world are those that are exporters of saving. They're accumulating savings rather than borrowing. And so it would appear at the first pass to be kind of a contravention of the sort of neoclassical capital flowing downhill story. But what's nice about his stories as he digs deeper into this is that he emphasizes the distinction between the public and the private sector. And your story here is all about sovereign wealth funds. And one of the points that he lands on about sort of growth and stabilization and resilience is a world in which you've got high public savings coexisting with capital inflows to the private sector. So capital in some sense is still flowing downhill into the private sector, but high levels of public savings, very often through sovereign wealth funds, are providing some sort of insurance mechanism that's protecting the private sector, securing the capital inflows to the private sector. And when you build that in, then this arbitrage difference that you're talking about, actually you've got to think about the return to the sovereign wealth fund. It's not just the direct financial return to the sovereign wealth fund, it's the contribution of reducing the cost of borrowing to the private sector. And that there is clearly a story off there in the medium term that kind of creates a slightly nuanced rationale for the sovereign wealth fund model. And that's not to contradict anything that you're saying. It's more just an observation about how to think of this balance between public and private saving over the medium term for emerging market countries. Thank you.
Superb. Rick put his finger on one very good question, which is why is it so? What's in it politically? Why is it so widely adopted? And I think there are three things going on. One is, and it's probably the most important one, there's an illusion of prudence on the part of the government. It looks, in the case of Ghana, which is which you analysed and which I was directly involved in, I had the task of explaining to the National Economic Committee of the Parliament why the appearance of prudence was an illusion. And it took myself and the guy who was temporarily the president of Switzerland, it took us a full 2 hours to explain to a specialist economic committee why it was an illusion of prudence and not the reality. So the fact that governments are putting money away as part of a pre-commitment strategy, no matter what else we do with the money, we will put it into this lock-away fund, gives the illusion, the signal of prudence. And it's very difficult to disillusion people about that, though it's completely bogus. The second thing is, and this is what, and nobody from the World Bank can say, but it's the pertinent question, is that there is a big marketing effort to establish these things, which is coming from the international investment banks. There are teams going in to establish these sovereign wealth funds, which they will manage. Of course, there are also teams going in to establish the sales for the national credit. So that one team will get you to borrow. You're a big country now. You can raise your credit on the government itself. You're creditworthy. And there's another team from the same bank setting up, saying you can save the money you borrowed. And then there's both. Why are these doing it? They're not doing it for charity. They're doing it because they charge very hefty fees. So you get these, it'll be often with the same investment bank, these two teams, and you pay heavily, you pay through the nose for the privilege of being fleeced by the banks. And unfortunately, naturally, the World Bank is not in a position publicly to say that, but I am. The third pressure is the pre-source curse. The pre-source curse, which you pioneered, is not just an effect on foreigners, though there is that effect, not least in the IMF, the exaggerated benefits expected. It's also there among citizens. So citizens come to believe with the discovery, we're rich, we don't have to work anymore. And that creates a pressure of expectations. We're rich, why haven't we been getting benefits? I worked with the government of Libya for a while. They'd got a signature bonus for exploration, which was, I think, it was a small signature bonus, and they never found anything. But of course, even a small signature bonus is in the millions, it was the low millions. And people, ordinary Libyan citizens, heard this and thought, gosh, we're all rich. And we're not benefiting. So who's got it? The government is crooked. They've stolen it from us. And I was then put up to explain that this was I think it was $2 per person. And I said, you know, you've got $2. Has that transformed your life? Would it transform your life if the government gave you $2? You know, which actually probably would have been the best bet, just to disillusion people that there's nothing else. That's all there is. My final comment, sorry I've been going on so long, is this the modern version, the 21st century version of an illusion of the early period of independence, which was the need to establish a national airline? The status symbol of national independence in the 1960s was the establishment of national airlines. And I don't know whether there's a study which ever evaluated those national airlines. As I recall, they all went bust. They left huge liabilities. So it's an early story of a fashion industry which went really bad. This is a much more virulent fashion industry with much greater dangers. Thank you.
I have a much shorter question. I'm also happy to discuss this in a break. I wonder if you could place this idea in the context of the debt for development swaps. There is some chatter about mineral-backed debt for development swaps. Not to put the responsibility of the World Bank on you, but the World Bank brokered the big Ivory Coast one not so long ago. And then on the private side, there is some discussion on, this goes a little bit more in the ESG direction, to connect minerals to sustainability-linked bonds with specific outcome payments. So I just wondered, in the context of thinking about finance and mining, specifically also in Africa, but also Latin America, where do you place the different instruments, and which of these you think have the highest success rate?
Thank you. Yeah, I have just a point on for the irrationality. I remember I was at the fund. I had some discussion with Rabat on this. Do you take into account the fact that in 2015, for instance, the GDP of Ghana has been rebased by 55%, and so some decision before and after? Of course, ex post seems look fine, but a lot of countries, and especially African countries, have very poor statistical data, and especially in GDP. And the rebasing are very important.
Can I ask one question? Yeah, I wanted to ask a question, yeah? Yeah. Yeah, I couldn't help but notice in your slides that comparing the GDP, the debt to GDP ratio to the fiscal position, Algeria on the fiscal position got worse, but at the same time the GDP ratio got better. And Equatorial Guinea was the opposite of that. Their fiscal position got better and the debt got worse. Do you any idea of why? And maybe if we looked, deeply into the case of Algeria, we might even advise others on what Algeria did best, and maybe have an idea of how to go forward.
Oh my God. Okay.
He's starving for a cup of tea. So
Okay.
he's not the only one starving for a cup of tea.
Thanks for the great questions and comments. I may have to find some of you during the tea break to do justice to this. So yeah, I think so. In the paper, there's much more on the political economy. The data doesn't tell a political economy story. So to your question, Rick, Paul told the political economy story much better, which is like what's going on here. And I think these points about the illusion of prudence, there is this sort of, I'm not going to talk about investment bankers, but there's definitely citizen expectations. It creates political expectations for additional consumption. There is certainly new access to borrowing that starts to happen. And so, of course, in the Ghana story, this was part of it, that the country hadn't had Eurobond access before. Suddenly this was something that was possible, and this played into the timing of the election and the promises that were made for increased consumption that the citizens were clamoring for because of this sort of pre-Zor's curse dynamic that expectations went very high. I think, and the national airline one, I think there's a lot of prestige associated with this, a lot of pride, which is understandable, of wanting to have your own sovereign wealth fund. I actually think there's a new one on the horizon potentially, which may or may not work out well, which is that everybody wants a smelter at the moment. And we've been talking about this over the last 2 days, and Amanda made the point that it doesn't make sense in every single country necessarily, and there's some pretty tough economics behind this. But from a purely political point of view, there's a lot of prestige at the moment being associated with getting smelters built. The additional point I'd make, I think, is the importance of interministerial competition. That I think there's interesting dynamics going on, that these sovereign wealth funds are not necessarily being designed by the Treasury. In fact, in some cases, it's the Ministry of Mines who are the big proponents of it. And this sort of, you can kind of see the evidence of this in terms of how this may or may not be linked to the budget. So in some of these countries, it's explicitly not linked to a budget surplus. And so there may be some sort of interministerial competition dynamics going on. And certainly if you talk to policymakers, one of the justifications they will say is, look, we can't trust the budget process to not go on a borrowing spree, to not fail to invest domestically, to tilt too much into consumption. If they get all the mining revenues, they're going to consume it all in the budget. And therefore, the sovereign wealth fund plays this important role of protecting these revenues from this dynamic. But of course, it doesn't shut the door on the budget still going on a borrowing spree, because actually there's all of these borrowing opportunities lining up at your door because you're now resource rich. And so this is dynamics that we might expect to see. You end up both with more access to sovereign debt markets and a sovereign wealth fund at the same time, which sort of drives this effect. Yeah. Okay. All right. The rest of you, I will catch in the tea break. But thank you very much for a very helpful suggestions.
We have a short break, and then we go back to the policy panel.